Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with a little bit about the question that comes up, or the statement that gets made oftentimes when we're discussing training. And I discussed that longer ranges of motion are generally better for hypertrophy. And usually, what we try to explain to people, anyone who understands how workload works, we try to explain to people that you're trying to pick exercises that allow you to move a heavy weight, when we're talking about big exercises, through the longest effective or safe range of motion possible. And that's what we're looking for. People will invariably bring up that, the squat, bench, and deadlift are partials, right? Not every single joint involved in these exercises, oftentimes in the traditional ways that they're done, goes through its full range of motion as far as all the joint angles of the joint. So therefore they're partials. And this needs to be discussed a little bit because this is a true statement, but it's not true so much to the point to where it completely limits their ability for hypertrophy. Now, we could argue about the deadlift a lot more so. If someone just said the deadlift, they would have a stronger point. But what people need to remember is that generally speaking, yeah, you want to use a longer range of motion if possible. But what you oftentimes find when we start looking at things like the squat's a perfect example of an exercise where when you look at the different joint angles involved, you don't necessarily get more hypertrophy going deeper than about parallel, right? About parallel, maybe a hair below it. Usually roughly what powerlifters do. And the squat being the exercise that this really is true the most on. In other words, performing the traditional squat in the way that's done at powerlifting meets and within their standards is actually a really, really, really good hypertrophy exercise, one of the best. When you do a full squat, you end up having to reduce the weight enough that you are losing some of the benefits. In other words, as we go deeper, as you go below parallel, what you usually find is that there's not really any more knee involvement beyond that, enough so to give additional quadricep development. So what you find is that as you go deeper, when it's looked at in EMGs below about parallel, roughly in that range, because it's going to vary from person to person. But as you go deeper, the quads don't get any additional stimulation. The glutes might, but what you find is that things like the hamstrings start getting less and less stimulation the deeper you go, interestingly enough. So you end up getting like a lot of slack in the hamstrings. And the reason this matters is because at a certain point, if we're not getting additional muscle stimulation, we are losing poundages off the bar. We're losing workload. We're losing tonnage. Therefore, you're getting less back development, less core development, everything else. Now, if it gave additional quadricep development, since the quads are usually going to be your most important focus on the squat, it's a full body exercise. You're trying to grow at least half the muscles in your body off the squat. But if the quads themselves, which is for a lot of people, this is their primary quad exercise, if the quads are not getting additional stimulation by going deeper and we're having to take 10 pounds, 20 pounds or whatever off the bar, trying to get another 3 inches of range of motion to go completely ass to grass or a full squat, it may not necessarily be worth it. And then you have a lot of people who this is where you start to develop back issues by going too deep, hip issues, things like that. Like a lot of times that is where your back problems come from on the squat. I always tell people that half squats are what damages your knees, right? Half squats damage your knees. Super deep squats, if you're not built for them, is what can injure your lower back, things like that. These are where you see your issues at. So there's a serious compromise to be made there on the squat. And when you look at an exercise like the squat, a parallel squat, you are moving a tremendous weight through a tremendous range of motion. That is a longer range of motion than you're going to do on 90% of exercises that you will do. And it's moving your entire body through space, stabilizing a big heavy weight with a tremendous range of motion. So we look at something like the squat and we go, oh, that's just a partial. You're getting absolutely ridiculous at that point. By the way, I know that I'm not doing the traditional big three in the video. This is just from my last few workouts. What I've been doing for my slots in the big three right now during my cut and a hypertrophy block for me for cutting and muscle retention. And actually, I'm not doing the traditional big three right at this moment. Big surprise. There are a lot of people like, oh my God, exactly. Because I don't necessarily put all my efforts into the squat, bench, and deadlift. That's a misnomer. But back to the point, The squat is going to give you a tremendous amount of development done this way. It really is. It's going to give you a lot of hypertrophy. So to argue that it's a partial, let's say it's very arbitrary at that point. Now, the bench press, I will agree on this. And this is why I tell people that we want to do things like the closed grip bench press. Why? Gives you a longer range of motion. Gives you a longer range of motion. Furthermore, it will always be pointed out. People will say, yeah, well, the bench, if the guys are really doing a lot of arching and they're doing the ultra wide grip and all of that, they're cutting their range of motion. And that I'll agree with. The way powerlifters do a bench press in competition will reduce hypertrophy, right? But the bench press itself, performed correctly, particularly a pause bench, if you're not doing a massive arch, you have a pretty good range of motion. And the argument is that what ends up happening, that, well, if your chest gets so big, it starts cutting range of motion down, and therefore you get less growth stimulation. Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and say if your chest is getting so big that it's starting to reduce range of motion, I'd say the exercise has been a pretty effective chest builder then, hasn't it, up till that point? I mean, it's kind of interesting. It's like, in order for the bench press, for people who aren't doing a big arch, to have more limited range of motion to where it becomes a problem for hypertrophy, it has to have been a tremendously and massively successful hypertrophy exercise already. That's kind of an irony, and that gets said by people in these same arguments. Let that sink in. It has to be successful at growing a massive chest before having a massive chest from doing the exercise starts to limit hypertrophy potential. That's funny. Here's your solution. Do more close grip. It increases the range of motion. It changes the angles and everything involved in the chest. And, is there a certain threshold where I would say you might want to do more for your chest than just the flat bench? Sure, absolutely. The press, by the way, the standing press, which I advocate everyone do, is still a good chest exercise, and it will never be limited by your chest size as far as the range of motion. So there's your accompanying lift. But failing that, I'm a big fan of weighted dips. I tell a lot of people out there, if you don't want to bench, I think the weighted dip, if you can perform it safely and you can track the microloading properly, is potentially a better size exercise than the bench press. In fact, I might even personally swap all my benching out for weighted dips for a little while. I might very well do that because I can always rebuild bench. If I build muscle on weighted dips, enough muscle in those areas, that'll transfer right to a bench for me as soon as I slip back into the technique, right? So when you look at it from that perspective and you understand that a lot of coaches have their lifters go to closed grip without an arch, and you guys notice I'm doing closed grip floor press, you end up getting a lot of range of motion again on the bench press. And again, you need to think about the fact that if you're doing a fairly narrow grip and you're not arching, the bench press has an extremely long range of motion. I mean, even look at me on the floor press with the narrow grip. Look how far that bar is moving. When you watch me do this here, you need to understand when I talk about partials, we're talking about half reps. Is that a half rep? Look at the distance move. Are you telling me you're going to move a dumbbell or a dip twice the distance I'm moving that bar? I don't think so. So people really need to put this stuff into perspective when they talk about this. And they need to understand that minor variations of these big lifts increase the range of motion back out to where they become extremely viable, true hypertrophy exercises. Because truth be told, even that closed grip floor press done there, or closed grip bench, you're going to build more muscle in your upper body with that than you are trying to mess with some dumbbell benches. You honestly are, and it's safer, it's easier to set up, easier to program. Done correctly, I think the lower injury risk. I think it's better all around, and that's my opinion on it. It's my opinion on it. So to try to stand there and say though that it's not going to put size on you, I'm sorry, but you can get a massive upper body off benching, particularly when you start taking the arching out. There's a difference between building strength and demonstrating strength, and I think the bench press is one of those exercises where this is noticeable. It's appreciable. It's one of those things that you will see based upon the style that you do it. Yes, it's possible to take the bench press and make it a less effective range of motion, but here's what it comes down to again, guys. Effective range of motion. effective range of motion, not intentionally cutting range of motion down so that you can try to maintain constant tension or a pump or any of that silly shit. That's what I'm talking about with range of motion. So when I say people need to be doing full range of motion exercises, that doesn't mean every single lift that you do, particularly your compound movements, needs to move every joint involved through its entire possible terminal range of motion to be an amazing hypertrophy exercise. If we're having a nice, solid, effective range of motion with a big weight on an exercise that you can do a lot of workload in that uses a lot of muscles, you're going to get big off that exercise. You are going to get big off that exercise. And this shouldn't even be subject to debate. And it's amazing to me that people want to debate that. And like I said before, ultimately the arguments against the bench press have to do with people arching, people using an ultra-wide grip, doing all this stuff to move more weight. And true, I would agree. That is exactly what I'm talking about when I say that people do silly ass partial exercises and then wonder why they're not gaining as much muscle as they could be. Well, that's part of it. You can turn the bench press. You can turn the bench press into such an exercise, but it's not by default one of those. In fact, done correctly and done with a mind towards range of motion, it's a tremendous mass builder, this overall size builder. And then we come over to the deadlift, right? The deadlift, everyone's favorite exercise. I think this argument holds true for the deadlift more than anything else. Now, the deadlift is an interesting animal there because, yeah, almost nothing gets moved through a full range of motion. It is an exercise that utilizes at least 80% of the muscles in the entire body that have to either brace isometrically, are stretched, or are primary movers, right? Pretty much everything gets utilized on the deadlift. But everything is a partial on the deadlift. And so in a way, the deadlift does fall into that category of an exercise that truly is a partial. Arbitrary range of motion, it's a partial exercise, and it can be hard to recover from, right? So, but people will look at the deadlift and say that, and then since they notice the fact that people do get big doing the deadlift, that, so this theory is false about partials. And it's like, well, no, it's not false at all. The deadlift is a prime example of a half rep exercise where you move tons and tons of weight. And yes, you will gain muscle off of it. But have you ever seen anybody get maximally jacked from the deadlift? The deadlift itself is a great addition to a routine because all these other muscles get worked in it. It helps you build strength. But most of the time, most of us who train the deadlift, unless we're specializing in the deadlift in a block, what happens? It gets a very, very, very low training volume. It does. And it's for that reason, because the amount of muscle growth it stimulates versus the fatigue involved, it isn't the best hypertrophy exercise in the world. It's almost a finisher. It's almost a finisher just to help stimulate some extra growth throughout the body if you have recovery to spare. That's almost the way to look at the deadlift outside of a competitive environment. But people have noticed that, though, that people can go and do a deadlift and they'll get big from it. So they'll use that to justify other exercises that are even more partial. Well, the conventional deadlift, if you're not pulling off blocks or a rack or anything else, has a decent range of motion. It's just still, it's a partial, it's a half rep. But you shouldn't use that to justify, doing 4-inch range of motion exercises. And that's exactly what people do, because they say, well, people do seem to grow from the deadlift. And that's correct. And that's the point we come back to. They do grow from the deadlift, but it isn't maximum growth stimulation. In other words, the deadlift works almost every muscle in the body, right? If you take a novice and you have them start deadlifting for 6 months, and then you go DEXA scan and measure everything, every muscle in their body will have grown if that's the only exercise they do, including their biceps, including their triceps, including their pecs. Everything will grow, actually, but they're not going to be as big as someone who actually came and trained 5 or 6 big exercises, right? They're going to be smaller. They're not going to get the same growth. And that's the point we need to make here with that for the people who try to extrapolate that to say, well, we can do all these other partials. Well, they're going to stimulate less growth. They're going to stimulate less growth. And the deadlift is arguably, because it is slightly a partial with a really heavy weight and a ton of axial loading, it's actually not great for fatigue management and hypertrophy. Again, it's one of those exercises that you need to program in carefully into the rest of your training unless you're going to specialize in it for a while, so that you're not limited in your other training by the fatigue that it creates. But arguably, as a lot of people have done, and experts and coaches, like Dr. Mike Israel is a prime example. He talks about this. There are deadlift variations, though, that are fantastic hypertrophy exercises. Start doing deficit deadlifts, snatch grip deadlifts. Why? Because it reduces axial loading. We're forced to use a lighter weight. It's still a big, heavy movement, though. You're going to move a lot of weight on those exercises relative to most lifts you do. And it increases the range of motion. So we get deeper joint angles on multiple of the joints involved in it, and it builds less fatigue. So that actually does become a fantastic hypertrophy exercise. But the point is true, though, that a conventional deadlift or a sumo deadlift is a partial exercise. And yes, in some ways, that does limit its hypertrophic potential, especially compared to the fact that the partialness of it allows a tremendous amount of weight to be utilized. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.